In the next edition of It's About Money, my guests are Ann Kuhn and Judith Ann Foyer-Herm. They're authors of the new book, Thriving in Retirement, Lessons from Baby Boomer Women. If you're thinking about retirement in any way, it's a show you'd want to see. Hello and welcome to another edition of It's About Money. I'm Nanette Nokan and thank you for joining us. I'm excited that my guests today are Ann Kuhn and Judith Ann Foyer-Herm, and they're authors of the new book, Thriving in Retirement, Lessons from Baby Boomer Women. So thank you so much for being here today. I love that the purpose of the book is to inspire women who are nearing retirement and to think about their own lives in asking the question, what's next? Talk to me about the objective, your objectives.
Yeah, I'll begin. Okay. I left the corporate world where I was coaching and heading up career management, and we moved to Rochester in 2012 to be near family and friends. At that point, once I had settled in, I thought, okay, what's next? And I wanted to be able to describe my transition from the corporate world to Rochester. So I wanted to be able, when we were at parties and other things, to be able to say, respond to, tell me about yourself, which is a very common question. And I wanted to be able to talk to it enough that people had a sense of who I was, where I came from, and what I was going to do moving forward or not do. So, and years ago, Ann and I talked about writing a book together. But it wasn't feasible at that time. It was back in the 80s, I think. And now we were living in the same city and the time was right. We met, discussed writing a book that addressed the very question, what's next, to other baby boomer professional women. So.
That's good. When Judy and I began to talk about working together, I had recently taken an early retirement after a career as an English professor and administrator at RIT. I was teaching literature and creative writing, and in those years I thought a lot about stories, from myth to memoir, and how stories help us capture and understand experience and to make connections with each other. I'd also done a lot of my own writing, academic and creative, but I was interested in taking on something new. And I was interested in looking at stories in a different way. So my initial interest in this project really came out of my own curiosity. I wondered, how would women talk about what they were going through? How would baby boomer women who had long careers talk about this transition after their full-time careers? And literally, what words would they use? What would they include? What would they leave out? And I was looking for the kinds of connections or patterns and how I might, weave women's stories together. So I think it's fair to say our objective really was to look for answers to this question, what's next, and to find out what women were experiencing and what common themes characterized their lives and their careers. As we gathered more research, that objective evolved. It really expanded, and we committed to writing a book about what other women beyond our small group could connect to, what they could find, how they could connect to similar experiences, and how they might be encouraged or inspired by a book that we could write.
That's great. So, how did the premise of the book develop?
I'll once again jump in. Well, we began brainstorming based on what each of us brought to the table, since we had two very different backgrounds. My primary background was coaching, career transition, and leadership development, and that was for a wide variety of business entities and individuals. And I was to ensure that they received the best services for their particular needs. So that was a strong analytical piece with the corporate entity and with the individuals. The experience taught me that although individuals share similarities, they also have differences, and how each person goes through a transition is based on those two factors. So professionally, I found that individuals make the best decisions for themselves, and by giving them cues or direction, they find their way. And whenever you give people too much information or you see how you think they should respond and what direction, they'll follow it a little, but then they go backwards because it's about coming from the inside. It's reflective and it's personal. So I really learned quickly that you have to give them the opportunities, even though it takes longer, to express themselves. And so finding that, now we developed a process based on that. Coaching model. First, we developed a survey to give us a broad perspective of their lives. And then we did one-on-one interviews to delve into the specifics. And finally, a focus group to give the women the opportunity to meet with peers and to look outside of themselves into for broader concerns and similarities. We developed the groundwork and narrative, and Cohort 25 developed their unique stories. It was a very clean move. Not so clean in terms of developing it, but...
But I just love the pattern that you guys took to do that. It's very thoughtful, and I love the Cohort 25.
Isn't that a great piece? As we were struggling with the book, it was he, she, we, they. Finally, Anne said, I got it.
We've got to give them a name.
Yeah.
And it's worked.
Yeah.
And it gives that group a sense of identity as well.
Oh, actually, I didn't ask you this before, but how did you come up with the 25 women? Did you just kind of...
Well, that's a good question. The exact number?
Yeah.
We started interviewing people in the Finger Lakes, Western New York State area, and we ended up doing about a dozen. And we had a pretty good representative sample. We'll talk about that diversity a little bit later. And then we thought, well, let's not have everyone be from this area. Let's expand it. And so it grew naturally. We found a similar number from out of the area of New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And when we got to 25, we thought, it's easy to do the percentages. We've got what we think is a representative group. And
yeah, that's beautiful.
And it really was about each of our areas. So Anne had been in Rochester, had many connections. I was on the East Coast. So it was bringing together those two groups.
And that was
where it made, and each person that we looked at came up with other people. So it was a networked situation. And so we had to actually we had to let go of some of the people because more than 25 would have been more than consuming. This was very involved for 25.
Right. It sounded like a nice group, but the name sounded really great.
Yeah, I love it.
that came later. I'll go back to the question of the premise just for a second. One thing we realized when we started talking was that we had both spent much of our careers helping other people, whether they were students or clients, make discoveries. And as we began to work to bring our two areas together, that emphasis on discovery became more and more important. I wondered what we could discover from women's stories. I knew that by carefully capturing not only what they said but how they said it, that we could gather some very rich material. So our premise became that if we could blend strategies from professional coaching with close attention to individual stories, it would be an ideal way to both of us bring in what we were best at, what we knew best, and it might give us a really interesting book, a different approach, a really unique methodology. And we've made that point more than once when we were looking for a publisher.
That's great. So, how was the process different than what you had expected?
Well, the content and structure of the coaching process were certainly known to me. That was the primary function for me. The learning curve was understanding Anne's writing process and appreciating the complex organization and structure of the chapters and how they kept moving around. If I had written the book, I would have assimilated, annotated, and presented the data with case studies. And so thank goodness for Anne. We had a readable piece.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's so easy to read and a lot of fun. So, yeah.
Oh,
that's
I'm
great.
glad.
How long did the process take?
From the week when we sat down together and started putting some notes, typing up some notes. Till the day that the books arrived from the publisher, it was almost 4 years to the date.
I see. Just
Yeah.
like a bachelor's degree.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely right.
So I love that you were like really weave the voices of the cohort 25, and not only did they help you gather the data, but you helped them, in the coaching aspect of it. So there are many lessons from the interviews that I'd like to talk about. I found them really intriguing and wonderful, and the first one I'd like to start out with is the influences from others, such as family.
Okay. Just a moment.
Basics.
I'm just shuffling papers here so that my notes are on top. The family piece. Both fathers, mothers, and siblings influence the women from childhood to adulthood in ways such as career choices, competitiveness, community service, and the belief that they could succeed was instilled in them early on by the family. As young adults, certain women and men became role models and examples for some of the women as they were fending their way in the workforce. And even before then, when they were in school, there were several women that shifted gears because of how people said, no, do it this way, or because programs didn't necessarily fit their objectives. So that was one of the big pieces for family.
We use the word culture to describe the unique characteristics of each family. And these were very important for individual women, whether the father had a military career. In one instance, the parents had met in a prison camp and later emigrated to the United States. Families with businesses, whether they were pharmacies or farms, they all instilled certain values and expectations about hard work and success, and the view of life that was particular to that family. All the women grew up in the same period. They were the same decile as they moved forward. They shared a lot of the same values, but each family had its own culture, and the more we talked to the women, the more we realized how those individual family cultures exerted an influence on how they saw themselves. And this was where our repeated involvement with the women and probing questions beyond just what we could collect in a survey really helped us learn about what made each woman unique and what her family's place had been in kind of bringing her forward. Within the family, fathers often encourage their daughters to have something to fall back on. And so it's not a surprise, a third of them had taught K-12 at one point or another. Very many of them moved on to other careers, although some did stay, career-long teachers, but they found ways to really make that new as they went forward. Relatives sometimes stepped in when the parents weren't very supportive, and a relative, an aunt, might have said, given a woman some guidance, some instruction. For one woman, it was very interesting. Her friend's mother was an unknowing role model. The friend's mother was artistic. She stayed up late. She was kind of a free spirit. And although she never talked to this woman when she was young directly, she had internalized a kind of role model and for herself as she grew older and talked about it. She said, I've never talked about this before, but she told us about it. But I want to add one thing. There were influences from family, from friends, but what they didn't get was a lot of formal guidance or formal career advisement. 95% of the women said when it came to high school guidance counseling and when it came to career counseling at the college level, they received none or minimal at best. So they really had to look elsewhere for guidance and for, just role models, suggestions about what they might do.
Interesting. That's quite powerful, actually.
It is.
Sometimes
It
people
is.
look for that structure. But then
And what was also very interesting was that the women from Western New York, or however we describe it, upstate, Western, I guess there's a big debate, and then from Boston to New York to Philadelphia, we were looking to see just how different the women were, and so much was that the similarities were very strong. So it again reinforced that the women followed the same paths in many ways, or directions, the opportunity. So that was sort of in itself interesting to us. We didn't know how different it would be.
Sure, that's great. What about bringing in the word power? And that's
Well, through their jobs, their careers, they develop responsibilities and power through decision-making, strategic direction, budgets, and employee development and engagement. Power was an integral part of their identity. And so it came in as just as it would for anyone that evolved and grew in an organization of any sort or in a career.
I see. That's great.
But when they retire, with that identity often goes that sense of power. It's not so much that they want to continue to be able to exert power, but they want to still be able to make a difference, to know that their input is valuable, to have some sense of agency, and that's become part of who they are.
I see. So it's not really power of control, but power of
Right.
result and impact. Yeah, that sounds good. So you talked.
Well,
Okay.
No, I was going to say, in most cases, who knows? Power has another whole meaning to some people. So
Sure, you're right. But then it
Yeah.
sounds like from these women, it's just being.
This
able
is
to
what it
make
was focused
impact.
on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see. Got it. So, and then the other part that I thought was interesting, having enough time. People wanted to make were happy to have the freedom to make choices. Now the ones take preference over needs, right?
Right.
During the retirement phase.
Well, during their new post-war reality, it allowed women the luxury to be able to choose what they wanted to do and when they wanted to do it. So that was the needs and wants piece. They now fill their own calendar with travel, creative projects, and time with family and friends. Those were some of the shifts.
It's really interesting because when they no longer had a day that was defined by a schedule or professional commitments, some women were thrilled at the idea of this kind of open sense of time, and others were very uneasy about it. One woman called it a big floaty thing. So each person really had to kind of sort this out for herself. Some people immediately got very busy when they retired. They accepted all the invitations to serve on boards, they volunteered their time, and later talked about having to pull back and think about where they really wanted to put their effort. One woman said she promised herself a year of saying no, that she would simply not accept anything, that she would have the freedom to think, to rest, to do what she wanted to do before she made any commitment. We use the word curating to talk about this, to describe this deliberate process of selection, where women take time, reflect, decide, almost like curating an art exhibit. What's going to go where? Where am I going to put my energy, my time, my other resources to make the best arrangement for myself right now? And understanding that curated arrangement can change. It will change.
That's really cool.
One thing that happens when people leave an intense job often or are transitioning to another job, the exhaustion is sometimes very comprehensive, and what they want to do is go hide someplace. They talk about, I want to go on a camping trip, or that's a very natural piece of the whole process. So now when they were leaving this specific career, some of them may have wanted to go camping. And then the others needed to be back into the mix, at least for a while. So it follows how the behaviors typically work. So no big surprises.
Yes, right. That's great. That's great. We're going to take a quick break. My guests are authors Ann Kuhn and Judith Ann Foyer-Herm. We're talking about their new book, Thriving in Retirement, Lessons from Baby Boomer Women. We'll be right back.
Maybe you can make retirement happen. After all, you made her college years happen. Opening that education savings account when she was little. Spearheading a campus tour. And another, and another, and another, and another. Bam! Deciphering financial aid. She was like, what? Well, now she's like, you aced planning for college. Now get the tips you need to get on track at aceyourretirement.org.
And we're back. I'm Nanette Nokan. It's about money. My guests today are Ann Kuhn and Judith Ann Foyer-Herm, and they're authors of the book Thriving in Retirement, Lessons from Baby Boomer Women. Thanks so much again for being here. Let's talk about making a difference for the women, making an impact in their transition from power to retirement.
I think it's important to remember that these women have been very involved with other people throughout their careers. They took charge of things, they helped others, they had a lot of responsibility, and I'm speaking in big generalities, but it's true for most of them that they were by no means working in isolation. They worked with and helped support a lot of other people. They made things happen, they made decisions. That became part of who they were, so that in retirement they are not so inclined to want to just kick back and relax. They really see these years as an opportunity, perhaps after doing some recovery and resting, but an opportunity to not only give back in the usual sense of the word, but also take everything they have learned and find a way to continue to help other people. One woman, for example, who is a very successful businesswoman, now takes on short-term projects helping young people write business plans. And she doesn't want a long-term involvement with any of these potential companies. What she does want to do is try to help ensure the success of some young entrepreneurs, as she once was. So I think that extension of staying involved and having an impact takes a different form now, but it's still very, very important.
And I think the basics of that come from the time where they grew up. That's why the specific cohort, during a period of change, which they became part of. And they were growing up in the time that was looking at discrimination, social injustices were being fought, new freedoms for women were being experienced. So all of these pieces started bringing them into the mix much stronger. And then they flowed through that into their jobs.
Oh, very nice.
In community.
So there was also a section about always producing, always thinking, always doing. So it's a lot of motion. Talk to me about that.
Well, this cohort has always been active in the community and workforce, and they continue to be interested in challenging and growing their minds. That's one of the things that came across very strongly with all the women. It's a very personal period for them. And Anne, you want to say more?
Well, the habits of a professional life really stayed with these women, and I think will always be with them. The desire, again, to sort of be doing something and doing something of value. When we first reached out to a retired teacher, as a matter of fact, she was teaching canasta. And she was teaching it in multiple venues, many days of the week. And she said, I love this, I love the game, I love teaching, but I feel like something's missing. And then we got back to her about a year later, after all the intermediary steps of the focus group and so on. We got back to her and asked her how she was. She said, I'm great. She said, I've created a business. She took everything she knew about teaching and everything she knew about canasta, and she created a business where she provides the tools, the cards, the strategies, and business was really taking off, and she wanted to make sure that we knew about it and that we somehow noted that this had happened. And she said, I am so happy. I have really found a way now to make more out of this. And I think that's a good example.
And your help in the process of the interviews probably helped her think about that in a significant way.
Yeah.
Very nice. So one of the observations I had is that the women of the cohort 25 appear to be really nimble, whatever it is from the beginning of their career, the family influence, what's happening in their career, and through retirement. Would you elaborate on that? I mean,
Sure. Nimble's a great word. These women were pioneers, but they were also survivors. They had learned how to take chances, how to be resourceful, and this is characterized throughout their careers. Situation might have not been going the way they wanted, and they found a way to make something new of it. One woman described going on maternity leave. She was very tired doing what she was doing. She was bored. She was an elementary school teacher. So she went on leave, not intending to go back. And while she was on leave, she got an invitation to join a team to develop curriculum for a brand new gifted program. So she said, okay, I'll go back for that. And it turned out she went, it was in Philadelphia. She spent her entire rest of her career developing all kinds of amazing projects and curricula for these students, and never looked back. And another woman just actually exhibited her nimbleness in a different way. she went to her employer and said, I have a good idea about another way to deliver this service that we provide. And the employer said, no, it'll never work, forget it. So she left. She took her idea, she became an entrepreneur, she started a business, and she became very, very successful with her idea. So that nimbleness really is part of who they were and how they could land on their feet and make something new instead of just sort of settling in and making do, in a bad situation.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to when they were growing up, being told they can do anything they set their mind to. So there were no limits, whereas with men, they were focused in one direction or another because the career became a very important piece because they would be needing it to support a family and whatever, and women weren't necessarily looked at in the same way. They needed the backup plan. So they had no real agenda or career path as they entered. So it was like, okay, I can do that. And the world at that time, the world of work, was like that because it was new for women to be in it and things were changing all the time. So they were able to adapt easily to the needs of a company, a position. They developed new skills, and many of them went back to school to get more degrees. And women, hence, as we move along, have more and more degrees than the men.
Sure.
That's another factor that happened.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty impressive, and then I also love that they're resilient. They're willing to make a change, and that word pivot, just kind of make
Pivot.
a change.
Yeah, I
great
borrowed that from Lynn Shear. Lynn Shear uses that word to talk about Sally Ride. Sally Ride wanted to be a tennis pro, and when she discovered that she didn't have what it was going to take, she pivoted. She made a strategic decision. She put all her energy in that direction. She prepared to apply to NASA because it had just opened up for women. Our people didn't use that word that way, but it certainly applies to the way they stopped, reassessed, figured things out, and went in a new direction.
And I imagine at retirement, that's what they do. If you get used to doing that in your life, that you just continue.
I think
on
that's
to do
true,
that.
Nanette.
Yeah, and women during their early careers were during the women's movement. So many other factors were feeding in, and I can remember in the 80s especially. And I guess the 80s especially, I was working with a law firm in Philadelphia, and one of the women, well, several of the women, were up for partnership, but they weren't getting it. And so they fought. And one of the women they absolutely focused on, Roma Young was her name, and she took the partners to task, and she won. Of course, in the end, we're not sure what she won because it's always tough after you've done it. But she did it, and that opened the door for many of the other women in that area. So they were always having to be there and taking the consequences of that. So it's being able, and she had a very secure job, but it wasn't enough.
Got it. Oh, great. It sounds like women are so powerful. And
They
it's really
are.
neat to read all about that. So, in closing, I mean, I think that the book is useful for anyone working with women, also for women, of course, but anyone working for women, like for myself, I work with a lot of women who are thinking about retirement, but when I define retirement, it's about financial independence. So your book has helped me think about other questions to ask beyond the financial
Yes.
independence side of retirement planning and asking the questions, what's next, So in closing, can you help me with what's next for you? Like what are you thinking about after, now that the book is done, what's next?
What's next for us most immediately is that we are having quite a good time with the attention the book is getting, and we are really, this is where Judy's ability to reach out and make contacts and get the word out has just borne such wonderful fruit. We are really looking forward to taking the book to an audience beyond Rochester and following up maybe with other kinds of presentations for women. Maybe you want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, one of the things we've been talking about, and I've had a call or two regarding it, is because of this focus in this group, we have talked about developing a seminar, a workshop, because women love that piece. And so it's something we haven't fully designed yet. I've been playing around with it. But it could be something where you send them material ahead of time in the book, and then they come into a group, and they basically have one big focus group with breakouts. So I think it's the whole purpose of this book and moving forward is to not have women think there's or anyone, how-to for this. It's about being reflective, it's personal, and so what our goal is to help them find the ways, the cues to do that.
That's lovely. I do want to thank you both. It was a wonderful conversation. Best wishes on the book, and thank you for sharing it with women, with me, with a lot of professionals. And thank you, our audience, for joining us. My guests today are Ann Kuhn and Judith Ann Foyer-Herm, and they are authors of the book Thriving in Retirement: Lessons from Baby Boomer Women. Until next time, I'm Nanette Nokan.